Hey everyone, welcome back to the Worldview Minute. I'm Pastor Levi Seeger. We've been walking through the science here, and I know that this has resulted in some pushback and some people saying, why don't you cite your sources and whatnot? And one of the things about when you grow up as a Christian in a society like ours is you're overly familiar with the opponent's point of view, but they are not familiar whatsoever about what you as a Christian or what the Christian faith actually believes. They only know the Christian faith through MSNBC and CNN and what they say Christians believe or what a sitcom might portray a Christian as, but they don't really know, and they haven't really ever heard the opposing arguments. I've heard the opposing arguments of naturalism and Darwinism my entire life, growing up in the public schools and whatnot, and living in a society where naturalism and Darwinism are the assumed norm. And so today I'm going to do a little bit more of just citing some of the sources. I have leaned really heavily on Nancy Pearcey's book, The Soul of Science, where she cites a lot of individuals, both Christian and unchristian alike, scientists and non-scientist historians, and just wonderfully researched book, original manuscript type stuff that she's dealing with in that book, and really walks through a history of science and its relationship to Christianity. And it's a wonderful book, and I encourage you to read it. But today what I want to deal with here is this constant idea that we have in our society of this war between Christianity or religion and science. Where did that idea come from? I think one of the ways it was best illustrated was in one of my favorite TV shows, Lost, in which one character named John Locke, named after the philosopher, and Christian Shepherd, the other character, they have this moment at the end, I believe, of season 1, in which John Locke describes himself as a man of faith, and he describes Christian Shepherd as a man of science. And that these two guys were constantly at war with one another. And actually, as the show goes on, Christian Shepherd actually becomes a man of faith, and John Locke at times struggles with this idea of faith. But where did this idea of a war between reason or faith and science come from? And as we have seen so far in what we've walked through, is that science requires a faith. It's not a free-floating institution. It doesn't exist on its own. There has to be some preconceived notion of reality before you can even begin to do science. And so scientists are slow to admit this, but there must be an undergirding philosophy and view of life that makes science possible. We have seen how the pagan worldview did not provide the groundwork for the scientific revolution. Did they have some scientific advances? Yes. As one person brought up, but what about the Islamic scientific revolution? Well, there wasn't really an Islamic scientific revolution. There was an Islamic golden age, and there's two things we should think about with this. Well, the first is that Islam claims to be the true version of Christianity and Judaism. Why did I bring that up? Because Islam, under the Prophet Muhammad, is borrowing from Christianity and its Christian beliefs, which enabled some of its rise of science. But even the scientific advancement of the Muslim empire were limited and did not result in the scientific revolution. And so that's my second point. There was no scientific revolution, but rather that the Islamic empire rediscovered Aristotle's works, translated them, and preserved them, and that this brought some enlightenment to them. But there was no massive culture shifting or inauguration of the scientific method that remade the world as we know it today. And so, as I said, I'm going to be relying heavily on the work of Nancy Pearcey and Charles Thaxton, The Soul of Science, which is a well-documented, well-researched book with lots of footnotes. You can fact-check me there if you like. But they point out that Lauren Isley, who was a 20th century award-winning scientist and scientific writer and historian, as well as a naturalist, so not a Christian, he acknowledges that the scientific revolution came about because of the Christian beliefs of the West. All right, we've unpacked that a little bit. But Darwinists and evolutionists, they don't like to know that. But this is a historic reality. To deny it is to show how biased and that you are trying to sell something to someone. They think that that we are unaware of their telling of history. The truth is that most of them have never researched the history of science or the philosophy behind it. Rather, we've inherited a scientific enterprise and we just assumed it was always this way. It wasn't. It developed in a particular time and location in history, and these things are not accidental. Where did this idea of the war between science and faith come from? For 3 centuries, this was not the dominant view. As the scientific revolution, as the seeds of it were being sown, the groundwork was laid, and science began to flourish and blossom, science and religion were not viewed as enemies. I'm going to read you a quote here from Pearcey and Thaxton. They said, yet this conception of warfare, that's between science and religion, is actually a misconception and one of recent lineage. something really recent. Over some 3 centuries, the relationship between faith and science can best be described as an alliance. The scientists living between 1500 to the late 1800s inhabited a very different universe from that of the scientists living today. So again, if you go back and you study the actual history, not just listening to what is pop history today, which is often just very shallow and trite, you can see that science and religion from the 1500s to the late 1800s were largely viewed as allies, not in opposition to one another. Colin Russell, in his book Cross Currents, our interactions between science and faith makes the same point, that this perceived war between the two is a recent invention. When did this begin? Well, really in the late 1800s, it kind of reached its peak or its tipping point in England with a small group of scientists and academics who were under the leadership of Thomas Huxley, sought to overthrow the cultural dominance of Christianity in the West. And he sought to establish, Huxley that is, the church scientific to replace Christianity. As the Enlightenment was reaching this turning point here, they were really trying to turn on Christianity. During this time period, a new literature flooded the market, arguing for a war between faith and science, that we had to choose either to be scientific people or faith people. Piercy and Thaxton again. They said the most virulent were works by John William Draper and Andrew Dickson White, works regarded by most historians today as severely distorted because of the author's polemical purposes. So they say there was all this writing at this time that tried to drive a wedge between Christianity and science. And the historians today who are actually trying to do historical work go back, look at these writings and compare to the historical record, and they say that they're not accurate. These people were exaggerating. They were selling a narrative. Unfortunately, that has largely become an unquestioned narrative today. But that narrative was opposed by other scientists and historians during that time frame or around that time frame, such as Alfred North Whitehead and Michael B. Foster, Piercy and Thaxton again. Scientific investigation depends upon certain assumptions about the world, and science is impossible until those assumptions are in place. As Foster argues, Western thinkers had to ascribe to nature the character and attributes that made it a possible object of scientific study in advance of, of the actual establishment of science. As Whitehead points out, the possibility of science came antecedently to the development of an actual scientific theory. That is, before the scientific theory happened, there had to be the possibility of science. This faith, Whitehead explains, rests on certain habits of thought, such as the lawfulness of nature, which in turn he maintains came from the Christian doctrine of the world as divine creation. Whitehead did not mean that everyone living in Europe at the time of the scientific revolution was a committed Christian. But even those who rejected orthodox biblical doctrines continued to live and think within the intellectual framework of the biblical worldview. Quote, I am not talking of explicit beliefs of a few individuals, Whitehead says, but rather, quote, the impress on the European mind arising from the unquestioned faith of centuries. So what Whitehead is getting at here is that the Christian worldview, even for people who weren't Christians at that time, they had certain assumptions about the reality of the world that were necessary to be there before science was possible. And even unbelievers held to those necessary assumptions. This is why there was a scientific revolution. It's, again, not Christian writers, not Christian historians largely, in what we're quoting here. Perhaps maybe the favorite trope brought out in this example of the war between Christianity and science is the story of Galileo. Now, if you know much about the story of Galileo, he argued for a sun-centered universe like Copernicus did before him. At that time, an Earth-centered view of the universe was the dominant view and had been for centuries. And as the story is generally told, that Galileo was oppressed and opposed primarily for religious reasons, and the Catholic Church sought him out and labeled him as a heretic for religious reasons. But that is not primarily why he was opposed. The oppositions to Galileo in his time and space were primarily philosophical and scientific, not religious. The idea that Galileo was oppressed because of the religious beliefs of an ignorant religious intellectualism is a recent argument. For centuries, people didn't make that argument. For example, the TV series by Jacob Bronowski, The Ascent of Man, paints Galileo as the scientist triumphing over the backwardness of religious dogma. The problem is that his portrayal, which has now become a dominant way people view this conflict, has little basis in actual history. Martin Rudwick, a scientist and historian, a scholar at both Cambridge University and the University of California, San Diego, not a Christian, said this of that TV series treatment of Galileo's trial. It was, quote, a travesty. A travesty. It's not historical. Why was Galileo opposed then? What was the primary objections to a sun-centered universe at that time? Well, Giorgio de Sant'Anna wrote what is considered by many the best book on the topic, the best historical examination of it. The book is called The Crime of Galileo. You can go read it for yourself. He rejects that we should frame this as an event or an argument between science and faith. He writes this, quote, "The major part of the church intellectuals were on the side of Galileo." How often have you heard that? Never. While the clearest opposition to him came from secular ideas. Giorgio de Sant'Anna, The Crime of Galileo, historical research done on this. If this is true, why then did the Catholic Church, in particular, oppose Galileo? Why did they do so? If it wasn't primarily religious, and it was primarily secular ideas, why? What were they? I'll have three. Three reasons why he was opposed. First, the cosmology, that is the origin of the universe, of Aristotle had ruled the day at that time in Europe and had ruled the day for centuries, and Galileo was arguing contrary to an Aristotelian view of the universe, instead for a Platonic view of the universe. Instead of Aristotle, he was arguing for something Plato had argued for. So at the heart of the disagreement between Galileo and church leadership was not religion proper, but it was philosophy. Now, of course, philosophy and religion are closely intertwined, but the Roman Catholic Church at that time was thoroughly in the camp of Aristotle, particularly through the works and reinterpretation of it through Thomas Aquinas. Aristotle had written in depth against a sun-centered view of the universe, and he was largely viewed to be correct. No one up to that time had thoroughly proven Aristotle wrong. He was sitting on the throne, and he had yet to be dethroned on this argument. And here are some of the arguments Aristotle used scientifically and logically to prove that the Earth was stationary. This was the scientific consensus of the time. He said that if the Earth was moving, then the shape of the constellations should change throughout the year, and that they should change the shapes or forms throughout the year, but they don't. So he says, here's the scientific evidence. We're observing something, and this is what we say. Second, he also argued that we don't observe the Earth moving. Through our own senses, it appears that the Earth is stationary. That is a large scientific hurdle to overcome. You'd be like, look, we're moving really fast. How? We don't see it. This was Aristotle's argument. Another argument he made is that when things fall, they fall straight down. If we were moving, they should fall at an angle, he says. Okay, no, they have limited scientific method here. The scientific method really didn't exist as we know it today, but this was the scientific evidence that Aristotle argued for, and they ruled the day for centuries, and it needed to be disproven. When Galileo challenged this, he challenged Aristotle's view of an Earth-centered universe, and he combined his challenge with a form of Platonic thought in opposition to Aristotelian thought. And so he was out of step with the majority of the intellectual elites of his day. It wasn't primarily the church that was driving against him, it was the other academics of his day. The second reason he was opposed was the rise of the Reformation. Galileo's trial came at a time when the Reformation was spreading and gaining steam. And at first, the Reformation sought also to cast off Aristotle's way of thinking, and particularly the Catholic versions of that. And sometimes people will throw in here that Luther and Calvin were also opposed to a sun-centered universes. And that assertion is made all the time, but the people who have dug into the historical record say that there's very little evidence for this whatsoever. Luther did make a few passing comments about it, and Calvin, contrary to what some people say, there's really no evidence that he cared about this debate whatsoever. But as Galileo also opposed Aristotle, as the Protestants did, and he tried to then move into the religious sphere and tried to overrule certain teachings within the Catholic Church, he was lumped in as a similar threat and an ally to Protestantism. So Protestantism is overthrowing Europe and the Catholic rule of Europe, and they're arguing for individual interpretations of Scripture. They're casting off a lot of Aristotelian thought. And here comes Galileo, who is a devout Catholic, and he's doing the same thing. So the Catholic Church looks at him, and they lump him in as a threat akin to that of Protestantism, that he's giving ammunition to the enemies of the Catholic Church. You need to remember here that the Catholic Church had a lot of political authority back then. They even crowned kings. The third reason Galileo was opposed was because he was opposing the scientific consensus of his day. Most scientists in Galileo's day believed in an Earth-centered universe. Galileo based much of his argument not on scientific argumentation, but on philosophical arguments and Platonic thought. Mary Hesse, English philosopher of science from the University of Cambridge again, not a Christian. This is what she says of Galileo's arguments at that time. Not whether or not he was right. We know he was right. But what evidence did he have to overturn the scientific consensus? She writes that he dogmatically, without sufficient evidence to support them, argued his claims. And so he was asserting this dogmatically, and he didn't have the evidence to back it up. And it turns out that he was right, but he didn't have the actual evidence to back it up. What we have here is that the Roman Catholic Church sought to defend the scientific and philosophical consensus of its day. So why was the Catholic Church so detrimentally wrong? I'm a Protestant. I don't care. I reject the Catholic Church. But why was the Catholic Church so catastrophically wrong there? Because they believed the science of their day. And they used their political and religious authority to back the science of its day. And they erred in that. Right? So what was wrong in that day was not religious belief. It was scientific belief. And then the scientists and the intellectuals turning to the Roman Catholic Church to do their dirty work for them. More examples could be given, but we should note that much of modern scientific pop history is more based on agenda-driven narratives than in reality and historical fact. I've cited here historians and scientists, many of whom are not Christian. And so this may come as a shock to you, but for those who pay attention, that the fact that over the last 150 years, we've seen a lot of attempts to rewrite history on the basis of advancing certain dogmas and agendas. The late Enlightenment, once it realized it had no foundation for truth, turned on Christianity with a vengeance and sought to vilify it to no end. And that it was Christianity that was keeping man down, when really it's the exact opposite. This much is true. Christianity brought about the scientific revolution. The Christian assumptions about the world that dominated the Christian West, the Christian Europe at that time, were necessary for this to grow. Again, science is not a free-floating institution or discipline. It requires a theory of knowledge, a theory of reality, a theory of man to function properly. And all of the theories necessary for that are best explained in the Christian worldview, not in the Darwinistic worldview, not in the pagan worldview. Again, we're going to unpack that some more, but hopefully this video was helpful. This episode was helpful for you, because we see that Galileo and the war between religion and science is often far more overblown than is actually historically accurate. I encourage you to like, comment, and share. Dig into some of these resources here, as they will help you to see this more. Don't just take my word for it. Look it up.